Tonight, we're stepping aboard a Viking longship, a narrow wooden vessel riding freezing seas, crowded with armed men, damp wool, fermented drinks, and absolutely no toilets. So before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of deep dive. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. At first glance, a Viking longship looks like a nightmare designed by someone with an active dislike for hygiene. It's long, narrow, completely exposed to the elements, and packed with men who have been sweating in wool for weeks on end. Weapons are everywhere. Food barrels roll across the deck. There are no walls, no privacy, no toilets, and no comforting illusion of personal space. If you describe this setup to a modern health inspector, they wouldn't argue. They'd probably just sit down and stare into the distance. And yet, these ships crossed oceans. Not gently, not quickly, but again and again, carrying crews across the North Sea, the Baltic, and even the Atlantic. They did it without turning into floating hospitals filled with groaning, feverish men begging to be thrown overboard. Which is remarkable, because later ships, with actual toilets and enclosed decks, somehow managed to do far worse. Historically, cramped travel spaces are perfect disease factories. Waste accumulates. Food spoils. Water turns questionable. Skin breaks down. Someone gets a cut. That cut gets infected. Suddenly, half the crew is rethinking every decision that led them there. This happened constantly on medieval and early modern ships, but not on Viking longships. At least, not nearly as often as you'd expect. The reason wasn't Viking super immunity or a special diet of raw courage. It was something far less romantic. They refused to let anything sit long enough to become a problem. Vikings didn't design ships for comfort. They designed them for movement, constant movement, relentless movement. Nothing stayed still long enough to rot, including the crew, emotionally. The ship itself worked against disease. The open deck meant wine was always blowing. Surfaces dried quickly. Smells didn't linger. They fled for their lives. Sunlight hit everything directly, which germs famously hate, even if Vikings didn't know why. Salt spray washed across the deck like nature's extremely aggressive cleaning solution. And most importantly, the ship was not treated like a home. Homes collect clutter. Homes tolerate mess. Homes allow you to say, "I'll deal with that later." A Viking longship did not. Anything unpleasant was removed immediately, usually by introducing it to the ocean. To Vikings, the ship was a temporary survival device, not a cozy space, not a living room, not somewhere you emotionally unpack. It was a narrow wooden agreement between humans and the sea that said, "We will not make this worse than it already is." And surprisingly, that agreement worked. After accepting that Viking longships looked like floating hygiene violations, the next step is realizing that their most dangerous-looking feature, the open deck, was actually the thing keeping everyone alive. What looks primitive from a modern perspective turns out to be aggressively practical. Later ships tried to be comfortable. They added enclosed decks, cabins, walls, privacy. And with those luxuries came trapped air, damp corners, and a slow but steady buildup of smells that suggested something had gone deeply wrong. Viking ships skipped all of that. They were open to the sky, the wind, and whatever weather the sea felt like throwing that day. This meant one thing above all else. Air never stopped moving. Wind swept constantly across the deck, drying surfaces before bacteria could settle in and start a little community. Sweat evaporated. Damp clothing dried faster. Moisture, which germs absolutely adore, had no chance to linger. It was immediately bullied off the ship by the North Sea. Smells, too, were temporary. Anything unpleasant was not allowed to hang around and emotionally scar the crew. It was carried away by winds so fast that no one had time to complain properly. You might smell something terrible for a moment, but by the time you open your mouth to say something rude, it was already gone. Problem solved. Sunlight was another accidental hero. Viking longships spent long hours exposed directly to the sun, which hit the deck, benches, ropes, and shields with relentless enthusiasm. Sunlight is a natural disinfectant. Vikings did not know this scientifically, but they absolutely knew that things left in the sun smelled better and caused fewer problems. Empirical science at its finest. The open deck also meant no dark, damp corners where rot could hide and multiply. There were no secret spaces for mold, mildew, or suspicious slime to develop personalities. Everything was visible. Everything was exposed. Everything had to behave. Of course, the downside was obvious. Rain fell directly on you. Cold air ignored your feelings. Waves occasionally slapped the deck like they were offended by your existence. Comfort was minimal, but comfort wasn't the goal. Survival was. Vikings understood something later. Sailors forgot. Sealing people into wooden boxes at sea does not make them safer. It makes them sick. Viking ships forced cleanliness through exposure. If something was wet, it dried. If something smelled, it vanished. If something became a problem, everyone noticed immediately. The open ship didn't just carry Vikings across oceans. It quietly prevented their ship from becoming a floating petri dish. And that alone gave them a massive advantage. If there was one unbreakable rule on a Viking longship, it was this. Nothing unpleasant was allowed to hang around. Not people with bad attitudes, not rotten food, and absolutely not bodily waste. Vikings understood in a very practical way that sickness starts when filth lingers. So, they made sure it didn't. Later, sailors would invent complicated systems for storing waste, hiding it, or pretending it wasn't there. Vikings chose a simpler solution. When someone needed to relieve themselves, they did not look for a corner, a container, or a polite excuse. They leaned over the side of the ship and let the sea take it immediately. No middle steps, no backup plan. This was not optional. This was routine. The ocean was not scenery. It was infrastructure. Solid waste went straight overboard. Liquid waste followed. Nothing was saved for later. Nothing was managed in a modern sense. Vikings had no interest in inventing a floating problem that could ferment, spread, or come back to haunt them during a rough wave. And yes, this required coordination. You didn't just wander off and hope for the best. Timing mattered. Balance mattered. A sudden wave at the wrong moment could turn an ordinary day into a personal saga that followed you for the rest of the voyage. Mistakes were remembered. Nicknames were earned. But the system worked because waste never stayed on board long enough to contaminate food, water, or sleeping areas. There are no buckets sloshing around. No hidden corners quietly becoming biological experiments. No accumulation. The moment something became waste, it stopped being the ship's problem. Food scraps follow the same rule. Bones, shells, gristle, spoiled bits all gone. The ship was not a trash bin. If it wasn't actively useful, it left quickly. This constant removal prevented insects from gathering. No flies, no rodents setting up camp. No smell strong enough to sink morale. The ship stayed relatively clean, not because Vikings scrubbed constantly, but because they refused to let dirt exist long enough to organize. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't dignified, but it was effective. Vikings didn't talk about hygiene the way we do. They didn't theorize. They didn't moralize. They observed results. Crews that kept waste moving stayed healthier. Crews that didn't last. So, they built the rule into daily life. Waste leaves the ship immediately. No exceptions. And in a world without medicine, that simple rule probably saved more lives than any charm, prayer, or heroic saga ever did. Once you understand that Vikings refuse to store waste on board, the next realization follows naturally. The ocean itself was doing most of the work. Not symbolically, not spiritually, very literally. The sea was the bathroom, the sewer, and the cleaning crew, all rolled into one vast, cold, judgmental system. To a Viking, the ocean wasn't just something you sailed on. It was an active participant in daily life. When nature called, you answered it by leaning over the side and trusting the sea to handle the situation with professionalism and zero follow-up questions. There was no porcelain throne, no curtain, no privacy, just wind, waves, and the quiet understanding that balance was important at this exact moment. This system worked because the ocean never stops moving. Waste dropped into it didn't sit nearby, plotting revenge. It was immediately diluted, dispersed, and carried far away. No stagnation, no buildup, no chance for bacteria to circle back and contaminate food or hands. The problem simply ceased to exist. It also helped that Viking longships rode low in the water. Anything released over the side was gone instantly, not clinging to the hull, or drifting lazily alongside like it might reconsider its options. The sea took it and moved on the way it always does. Food waste followed the same path. Bones from dried fish, shells, scraps of meat that had gone questionable. All of it went overboard quickly. The ship was not a landfill. It was a narrow platform where everything had to justify its presence. If it couldn't be eaten, used, or repaired, it was politely introduced to the North Sea. This constant clearing had a powerful side effect. Pests never had time to arrive. Rats, flies, and insects thrive on leftovers and waste. Viking ships offer them nothing. There was no trash pile to attract them, no lingering smell to signal opportunity. Even if something did fall on deck, it didn't stay long enough to become interesting. Of course, this system required discipline. You didn't delay. You didn't get lazy. You didn't decide, I'll deal with that later. Later was how people got sick. Later was not welcome on a long ship. Was it dignified? No. Was it comfortable? Also no. Was it effective? Extremely. The Vikings didn't need plumbing, chemicals, or written sanitation laws. They had something better. A moving ship, a moving sea, and a strict rule that said nothing unpleasant was allowed to linger. And as long as the ocean kept moving, so did their chances of staying healthy. On a Viking longship, food was precious. Food scraps were not. The moment something stopped being edible, it became a threat. Vikings did not romanticize leftovers. They did not believe in saving questionable bits just in case. If something smelled wrong, looked wrong, or felt like it might start a rebellion in your stomach, it was gone immediately. This wasn't wastefulness. This was survival logic. Rotting food is an invitation not just to illness, but to insects, mold, and a slow descent into misery. Vikings had learned, probably the hard way, that scraps hanging around long enough would turn a healthy ship into a floating apology letter to the gods. So, they ran a tight operation after meals, bones, shells, cartilage, and anything too tough or suspicious to eat were tossed overboard. Fish guts gone. Moldy bread gone. That one piece of dried meat that tasted like regret. Definitely gone. The ship was not a pantry. It was a transit space, and nothing stayed unless it earned its place. This constant clearing kept smells from building up. Smell matters more than people think. Smell is the first warning sign that bacteria are having a very good time. Vikings didn't need microscopes to know this. They follow their noses. If the ship started to smell off, something was already wrong. It also prevented pests from moving in. Rats, flies, and other opportunistic creatures rely on consistent food sources. Viking ships offered none. A rat might swim over once. It would find nothing to eat and immediately reconsider its life choices. Insects had no reason to gather. There was simply nothing for them. Food storage itself was designed to avoid spoilage. Dried fish, smoked meat, hard bread. Everything was preserved to last, not to impress. Fresh food was eaten quickly. Anything that couldn't survive a long voyage was consumed early or left behind. And here's the quiet genius. The open deck helped again. Airflow dried food faster. Sunlight slowed spoilage. Moisture, the true enemy, had nowhere to hide. This approach required discipline. You didn't get sentimental about scraps. You didn't hoard. You didn't experiment. You ate what was safe and removed what wasn't. Vikings understood something deeply practical. You don't get sick from hunger nearly as fast as you get sick from rot. So, scraps were treated like enemies. They were identified quickly, and they were removed without hesitation. And that ruthless efficiency kept the ship healthy, one meal at a time. At this point, you might be wondering how Vikings handled drinking water, because surely that is where everything falls apart. Weeks at sea, wooden barrels, no refrigeration, no purification tablets. This should have been a disaster. And it would have been if Vikings had relied on plain water. They didn't. Vikings understood something instinctively that later sailors would repeatedly forget. Stored water goes bad. It grows things. Things with opinions. Things that make you regret every choice you've ever made. So instead of trusting water alone, Vikings leaned heavily on fermented drinks. Ale, beer, and other lightly fermented beverages were standard on long ships. Not because Vikings were constantly partying, although morale certainly benefited, but because fermentation made these drinks safer to consume than stagnant water. The process killed harmful bacteria, and created an environment that discouraged new ones from moving in and starting families. The result was a crew that was mildly buzzed, reasonably hydrated, and significantly less likely to die from waterborne illness. A strong strategic trade. These drinks were low in alcohol by modern standards. Think more liquid bread than blackout. Enough to preserve the drink and keep it safe, but not enough to make steering a longship feel like a personal challenge issued by the gods. Water was still carried, of course, but it was rationed carefully and consumed early in the voyage. Everyone knew it wouldn't last. Once it turned questionable, it was avoided. No one argued. Experience had already settled that debate. Fermented drinks also served another purpose. They masked unpleasant tastes and smells. If your cup didn't taste amazing, that was expected. It wasn't meant to. It was meant to keep you alive. Vikings were not picky. They were pragmatic. And let's be honest, a slightly sour drink was preferable to severe stomach distress in the middle of the ocean with no privacy and nowhere to lie down. Some problems compound. Vikings chose not to invite those problems on board. This system required planning. Barrels had to be sealed properly. Drinks had to be prepared in advance. Supplies had to be calculated carefully. It wasn't improvisation. It was logistics. Once again, Viking survival came down to understanding one simple rule. If something can spoil, it will. If something has already been stabilized, it's your friend. So, while later sailors suffered horribly from contaminated water, Vikings quietly sipped their fermented safety net and continued rowing. Not glamorous, not refined, extremely effective. And in the brutal math of survival at sea, that was more than enough. If fermented drinks were the Vikings' insurance policy against bad water, then salt was their quiet, unsung miracle substance. Salt wasn't seasoning. Salt wasn't luxury. Salt was a survival technology, and Vikings used it everywhere, whether they realized the science behind it or not. Nearly all food on a long ship was aggressively salted. Fish, meat, even butter and cheese were packed in salt until they became tough, dry, and extremely unexcited about growing bacteria. Fresh food was eaten early in the voyage before it could turn into a health risk. Everything else was preserved so thoroughly that microbes took one look and decided to live elsewhere. This mattered more than people realize. Food poisoning on land is unpleasant. Food poisoning at sea in cold weather with nowhere to rest and nothing to replace lost fluids is catastrophic. Vikings avoided this by simply refusing to eat anything that hadn't been thoroughly bullied by salt. But salt wasn't just for food. Hands were often rubbed with it after handling meat or fish. Deck surfaces absorbed it naturally from sea spray, ropes, benches, shields. Everything slowly became salty just by existing on the ship. And salt, inconveniently for bacteria, dries things out. Dampness is where sickness thrives. Salt made dampness uncomfortable. The smell of a Viking long ship wasn't pleasant, but it was revealing. It smelled briny, sharp, clean in a harsh coastal way. That smell wasn't rot. It was preservation. Modern people might wrinkle their noses, but medieval noses understood that salty air meant fewer problems. Salt also discouraged pests. Insects hate it. Rodents avoid heavily salted environments. Even mold struggles to get established when everything tastes like it has been aggressively seasoned by the sea itself. And then there was sweat. Long voyages meant rowing. Rowing meant sweat. Sweat plus wool plus cold air is a recipe for discomfort. But salt helped here too. Sweat dried quickly. Clothes didn't stay damp long enough to grow the kind of bacteria that leads to skin infections and sores. Vikings didn't talk about sanitation the way we do. They didn't categorize or label. They simply noticed patterns. Ships that stayed dry, salty, and moving stayed healthier. Ships that did not have long careers. Salt was everywhere. It was unavoidable, and it worked. So, while later sailors struggled with decay, sickness, and infestation, Viking crews lived inside a floating, windswept, salt-cured environment. Uncomfortable? Yes. Pleasant? No. Effective? Absolutely. One of the most important sanitation tools on a Viking longship wasn't something you could touch, store, or accidentally drop overboard. It was motion. Constant, relentless motion. The ship rarely rested, and neither did the environment on board. And that unintentionally made all the difference. Decay loves stillness. Rot settles in when things stop moving, stop drying, and stop being disturbed. Vikings never gave it that opportunity. Their ships were always in motion, rocking, pitching, cutting through waves, or being hauled up and dragged back into the water. Even when anchored briefly, the sea kept moving underneath them, slapping the hull and washing the sides like it had a personal grudge. This movement acted like a reset button. Water splashed over the deck regularly, rinsing away grime before it could get comfortable. Salt spray coated surfaces again and again. Anything loose was either washed away, dried out, or knocked somewhere obvious where someone would notice and deal with it. Nothing was allowed to quietly rot in a forgotten corner, because forgotten corners barely existed. Even sleeping areas benefited. Vikings slept on benches, or directly on the deck, rolling up bedding during the day. Bedding that stays rolled up and aired out does not become a breeding ground for moisture-loving bacteria. Bedding that sits still for weeks absolutely does. Vikings chose the former whether they knew the science or not. Movement also forced constant maintenance. You couldn't ignore problems when the ship itself kept reminding you of them. A damp rope slapped your leg. A loose board shifted under your feet. A leaking barrel announced itself loudly. Problems were dealt with immediately, not because Vikings were neat freaks, but because ignoring them was dangerous. Later ships with enclosed decks and static sleeping quarters created the perfect environment for decay. Viking longships did the opposite. They exposed everything to motion, air, and attention. If something started to go bad, everyone noticed. And when everyone notices, something gets done. Even people were affected. Crew members were always adjusting their footing, shifting position, rowing, or bracing against waves. Blood kept moving. Body stayed active. Cold was unpleasant, but stagnation was worse. Vikings chose movement. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't relaxing. It wasn't designed to be. But constant motion meant fewer damp surfaces, fewer hidden messes, and far fewer opportunities for sickness to take hold. In the end, Viking ships stayed healthy for the same reason they stayed fast. They never stopped moving long enough to let problems settle in and make themselves at home. And at sea, that mattered more than comfort ever could. After wind, salt, and constant motion, the Vikings' final accidental ally was something they never wrote sagas about, but relied on daily. Sunlight. Not metaphorical enlightenment. Actual unforgiving daylight beating down on an open wooden deck. Viking longships had no roofs, no shaded corridors, no cozy corners where dampness could hide and start plotting. Everything on board was exposed to the sky. When the sun came out, and yes, even the North Atlantic gets sun occasionally, it hit every surface directly. Deck planks, benches, ropes, shields, clothing, and people all baked together in a shared, mildly uncomfortable experience. This mattered more than anyone at the time understood. Sunlight is one of nature's most effective disinfectants. It dries moisture, breaks down bacteria, and makes life extremely difficult for anything that thrives in darkness. Vikings didn't know the science, but they absolutely noticed the results. Things left in the sun stayed cleaner. Things kept damp turned problematic. The conclusion was obvious. Let the sun do its thing. Wet clothes were draped openly to dry. Bedding was aired out regularly. Gear was laid out instead of stacked in dark piles. Even food barrels were opened when possible to let air and light in, discouraging mold from getting ideas. If something smelled wrong, the solution was often leave in the sun and see if it behaves. Sunlight also discouraged pests. Insects prefer shade. Mold prefers darkness. Bacteria prefer moisture. Viking ships offered very little of any of these for long periods. Everything was bright, windy, salty, and exposed. Essentially, the least inviting environment possible for microscopic freeloaders. Of course, this came with drawbacks. Sunburn existed. Glare existed. Long hours squinting at reflective water existed. Vikings endured all of it because the alternative was worse. A little discomfort in daylight was preferable to sickness in the dark. Later ships with enclosed decks and shaded interiors removed sunlight from daily life at sea. And with that removal came dampness, rot, and disease. Viking ships, by contrast, leaned fully into exposure. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was protected from the elements. And because of that, nothing had much chance to fester. So, while sunlight might seem like a passive background feature, on a Viking longship, it was an active cleaning agent. Harsh, relentless, and impossible to ignore. The Vikings didn't worship the sun for sanitation. They just let it work. And once again, that quiet practicality kept them healthier than many sailors who came centuries later with far more technology and far worse results. This is usually where the modern imagination protests. Surely Vikings, men who sailed into icy storms and slept on wooden benches, didn't care about cleanliness. Surely grooming was optional. Surely everyone just accepted constant filth as part of the aesthetic. No, absolutely not. Vikings groomed themselves, and they did it regularly. Not out of vanity, although that certainly didn't hurt, but because experience had taught them something simple. Neglect your body, and it will betray you at the worst possible time. Archaeology makes this painfully clear. Viking sites are filled with combs, tweezers, ear spoons, and grooming tools. These weren't rare luxury items. They were everyday objects carried, used, and lost often enough to show up all over the archaeological record. You don't carry a comb on a longship because you enjoy looking fabulous in a storm. You carry it because lice, skin infections, and sores are morale killers. And morale matters when everyone is rowing in the cold. Hair was kept clean and managed. Beards were trimmed. Clothing was shaken out, aired, and dried whenever possible. Dirt that stays wet turns into infection. Dirt that dries and flakes off becomes much less interesting. Vikings understood this without ever needing to name a bacterium. They also understood wounds. Cuts were inevitable. Rope burns, splinters, blisters, nicks from tools and weapons. An untreated wound at sea could become infected quickly. So wounds were cleaned, dried, and bound. Not gently, not delicately, but thoroughly enough to keep them from becoming a problem that spread. There was also social pressure. A longship was a shared space. If someone smelled especially bad, was visibly filthy, or allowed parasites to spread, everyone suffered. Viking crews were tight-knit and blunt. You were corrected quickly, usually with words, sometimes with looks that said, "Fix this or become the problem." And here's the quiet irony. Viking grooming routines were often more consistent than those of later sailors on enclosed ships. Those sailors lived below deck, rarely dried their clothes properly, and let moisture sit against skin for weeks. Vikings, exposed to air and sun, dried everything constantly. So, no, Vikings were not pristine. They were not clean by modern standards, but they were managed. They kept themselves just clean enough to function, just clean enough to avoid sickness, just clean enough to keep the ship from turning into a medical crisis. And on a long voyage, that was more than enough. For all their toughness and bravado, Vikings were not romantic about illness. They didn't believe sickness made you noble, heroic, or spiritually interesting. Sickness was a liability, and on a long ship, liabilities were dealt with quickly, quietly, and without sentimentality. If someone fell ill, it was not brushed off as he'll walk it off. Viking crews had learned through experience that one sick person could become many sick people if nothing was done. So, illness was treated as a logistical problem, not a personal failing. The open design of the longship helped immediately. There were no enclosed rooms trapping breath and moisture. Sick crew members could be positioned downwind away from food and shared gear. Airflow reduced the spread of whatever was causing the problem. Even if no one could explain why it helped, it just did. Distance mattered. If someone was vomiting, feverish, or clearly unwell, they were kept apart as much as the ship allowed. This wasn't cruelty. It was prevention. Viking crews understood that close contact turned problems into disasters. Isolation was survival, not punishment. And here's where the brutality comes in. Because Vikings were not gentle about this part. If someone became seriously ill and could not function, they were dead weight. That sounds harsh, but on a long voyage, it was reality. A crewman who could not row, steer, or fight endangered everyone. The ship did not slow down because one person was having a bad week. This doesn't mean sick people were immediately thrown overboard, but it does mean there was very little tolerance for ignoring symptoms or pretending everything was fine. Problems were confronted early because late intervention was worse. Minor illnesses were managed with rest when possible, warmth, and whatever remedies were known. But prevention always came first. Clean surroundings, fresh air, no waste buildup, no rotting food, no damp bedding. These measures mattered far more than any treatment once sickness took hold. Later sailors often failed here. They had illness. They kept sick men below deck. They let disease spread quietly until it exploded. Viking ships, exposed and communal, made hiding sickness almost impossible. Everyone saw everything, and because everyone saw it, everyone acted. The Vikings didn't need medical theory to understand one core rule. If you ignore sickness, it spreads. If you confront it early, it often doesn't. So illness was not ignored. It was managed, contained, and respected as a real threat. And that realism saved lives. If there is one thing worse than dozens of men sharing a narrow wooden ship, it is dozens of men sharing a narrow wooden ship with animals. Vikings understood this very clearly. Animals produce waste constantly, enthusiastically, and unlike humans, they do not lean politely over the side when nature calls. So while animals absolutely existed in Viking life, they were carefully limited on long voyages. Short trips, coastal travel, or river journeys might include livestock. Long ocean crossings, not a chance. Bringing animals aboard for weeks at sea was an excellent way to turn a functional ship into a floating catastrophe. Waste was the primary concern. An animal produces far more waste than a human, and it does so without any regard for timing, balance, or personal space. There is no convenient moment to clean up after a goat in rough seas. There is only regret. Animals also required water and food, both of which were already limited. Every barrel given to a sheep was a barrel, not given to the crew. Vikings were practical enough to understand that if survival came down to a choice between people and livestock, the livestock lost every time. Then there was disease. Animals carry parasites, fleas, ticks, lice, all eager to explore new hosts. On land, this is manageable. On a long ship, it is a nightmare. One infested animal could spread pests to the entire crew within days. Vikings didn't need scientific explanations to understand this. They only needed one bad experience. Archaeological evidence supports this caution. Longships were designed for speed, cargo, and people, not stalls. There are no built-in systems for managing animal waste at sea because Vikings intentionally avoided creating that problem in the first place. When animals were present, they were kept briefly and managed tightly. Chickens might appear for short coastal journeys. Livestock might be transported across rivers. But for open ocean travel, animals were left behind. Preserved food traveled better than living creatures. This choice wasn't sentimental. Vikings valued animals deeply, but they valued reaching their destination alive more. By eliminating animals from long voyages, Vikings removed an enormous source of waste, disease, and logistical stress. Fewer variables, fewer problems, less chaos. It's another example of Viking thinking at its most unromantic and effective. If something creates more problems than it solves, it does not get invited on the ship, and that rule applied equally to people. It's tempting to assume that cold was just another enemy Vikings had to endure at sea. And yes, it was unpleasant. Fingers went numb, clothes stiffened. Wind found ways into places it absolutely did not need to be. But from a sanitation standpoint, the cold was quietly working in the Vikings' favor. Cold slows everything down, especially bacteria. In warmer climates, rot moves fast. Food spoils quickly. Waste smells sooner. Illness spreads more aggressively. Viking voyages, however, often took place in cold northern waters where temperatures stayed low enough to keep bacterial growth sluggish. This meant food lasted longer, smells developed more slowly, and minor messes didn't immediately turn into full-blown health crises. In a strange way, the North Atlantic acted like a massive natural refrigerator. Not a comfortable one, not a polite one, but an effective one. Meat stayed preserved. Fish remained edible longer. Damp materials dried rather than molding, especially when combined with wind and salt. Cold reduced the urgency of constant cleaning without removing the need for discipline. Cold also discouraged pests. Insects thrive in warmth. Rats prefer stable, mild environments. Viking longships offered neither. The combination of cold air, constant movement, and exposure made life on board deeply uninviting to anything small, sneaky, and disease-carrying. Even parasites struggled to get comfortable. Of course, cold came with risks. Frostbite existed. Hypothermia existed. Vikings weren't immune to any of this. But they understood the balance. They layered clothing. They kept moving. They stayed active. A moving, slightly uncomfortable crew was far healthier than a warm, stagnant one. Cold also encouraged good habits. Wet clothes were dried quickly because staying damp in cold weather was dangerous. Bedding was aired out constantly. People paid attention to their bodies because ignoring the cold had immediate consequences. This constant awareness prevented many of the slow-building problems that plague warmer, enclosed environments. Later sailors traveling in warmer waters or sealed ships lost this accidental advantage. Warmth encouraged rot. Dampness lingered. Bacteria thrived. Vikings, by contrast, lived inside an environment that punished neglect immediately and rewarded vigilance. So, while cold made Viking voyages harder, it also made them cleaner, less comfortable, but healthier, less forgiving, but safer. In the brutal arithmetic of survival at sea, cold wasn't just an obstacle. It was an unwilling ally, and the Vikings learned to work with it, not against it. By now, it should be clear that Viking sanitation didn't rely on comfort, technology, or written health manuals. It relied on something far more effective and far more terrifying: discipline. On a long ship, discipline wasn't a virtue. It was a requirement for continued existence. A Viking crew was not a casual group of travelers. It was a tightly bound unit where every individual's behavior affected everyone else. There was no room for freeloaders, corner cutters, or people who thought rules were more like suggestions. If you caused problems on board, those problems became communal very quickly, and communal problems were handled communally. Hygiene rules weren't debated. Waste went overboard immediately. Food scraps disappeared as soon as meals ended. Wet clothing was dried. Bedding was aired. Gear was kept in order, not because someone enjoyed it, but because failing to do so made life harder for everyone. And Vikings had very little patience for people who made life harder. Social pressure did most of the enforcement. On a long ship, there was nowhere to hide. If someone ignored basic discipline, everyone noticed. The crew didn't need formal punishment systems. Disapproval was loud, direct, and effective. If that failed, consequences escalated quickly. Viking culture was not known for gentle reminders. Discipline also extended to routine. Tasks were assigned. Responsibilities rotated. Cleaning wasn't a separate activity. It was woven into daily life. You didn't clean the ship. You lived in a way that prevented filth from existing in the first place. This discipline created predictability. Everyone knew what was expected. Everyone knew the cost of failure. And everyone understood that discipline wasn't about authority. It was about survival. A disciplined crew stayed healthy. An undisciplined crew became a liability. Later ships often failed here. Larger crews, less cohesion, less accountability. People could hide their mistakes below deck until sickness spread too far to control. Viking longships offered no such luxury. Everything was visible. Everything was shared. And because everything was shared, responsibility was too. Discipline kept waste moving. Discipline kept food safe. Discipline kept sickness from spreading. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't kind. But it worked. And on the open sea, working was the only thing that mattered. When you step back and look at the whole picture, the real surprise isn't that Vikings managed waste on long ships. It's that they managed it so well without ever calling it sanitation. No theories, no diagrams, no experts arguing in a long house about best practices. Just observation, experience, and a ruthless willingness to remove anything that caused problems. Vikings didn't survive at sea because they were fearless or immune to disease. They survived because they refused to let small problems become large ones. Waste never stayed long enough to ferment. Food never lingered long enough to rot. Water wasn't trusted once it turned suspicious. Sick people weren't ignored. Dampness wasn't tolerated. Nothing was allowed to settle into a comfortable, dangerous routine. Every part of life on a long ship worked against disease. The ship itself was open, windy, and exposed to sun and salt. Waste went straight into the sea. Motion kept surfaces dry. Cold slowed bacterial growth. Salt preserved food and discouraged decay. Fermentation made drinks safer than water. Grooming reduced parasites. Discipline enforced all of it without debate. None of this was gentle. None of it was pleasant. But it was consistent. And consistency is what matters. Later sailors with better ships and worse habits often failed here. They trusted enclosed spaces. They stored waste. They ignored dampness. They had illness. They assumed comfort meant safety. Viking longships, uncomfortable and exposed, forced good behavior through sheer inconvenience. There was no room for denial, no room for laziness, no room for pretending things would sort themselves out. If something smelled wrong, it was already gone. If something felt wrong, it was dealt with immediately. If someone caused problems, they stopped or they didn't remain part of the system. This wasn't heroism. It was logistics, and that's the part most stories skip. Vikings weren't just raiders and warriors. They were managers of chaos. They understood that surviving the sea required cooperation with the environment, not domination over it. So, how did Vikings manage waste on longships without getting sick? By never letting waste exist long enough to matter. By letting wind, water, sun, and salt do most of the work. By enforcing discipline without mercy. And by accepting discomfort as the price of survival. Not glamorous, not cinematic, but effective. And in the end, effectiveness is why Viking ships crossed oceans and came back. Catherine the Great did not enter the world destined to rule Russia. She arrived in 1729 as Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess from a family that had a title, but very little money, influence, or future. Her childhood was not filled with luxury or political grooming. It was filled with cold rooms, strict discipline, and a mother obsessed with appearances. Sophie learned early that survival depended not on affection, but on control. Control of behavior, of emotion, and eventually of people. From a young age, Sophie showed a sharp, almost unsettling intelligence. She was not the most beautiful child, nor the most charming, but she watched everything. While others spoke, she listened. While others complained, she adapted. She devoured books on history, philosophy, and politics, quietly, forming ideas far beyond what was expected of a small German noblewoman. She learned that power did not always belong to the loudest voice in the room. It often belonged to the most patient. Her opportunity arrived unexpectedly. Empress Elizabeth of Russia needed a bride for her nephew and heir, Peter. Sophie was selected not because she was extraordinary, but because she was convenient. She was young, foreign, and politically harmless, or so they thought. At 14, Sophie was summoned to Russia, a land whose language she did not speak, whose customs were alien, and whose court was famously brutal. Most girls in her position would have tried to please. Sophie chose something more dangerous, transformation. She learned Russian obsessively, practicing until her tongue bled. She converted to Orthodox Christianity with theatrical devotion, renaming herself Catherine the Great, not as an act of faith, but of strategy. She fell ill repeatedly, nearly dying from exhaustion, yet refused to slow down. Catherine understood something crucial. Russia did not need to love her immediately. It only needed to stop seeing her as foreign. Her future husband, Peter, made this easier. He was childish, unstable, openly cruel, and deeply unpopular. While Peter played with toy soldiers and humiliated himself at court, Catherine watched. She built alliances quietly. She learned who mattered, who drank too much, who hated whom. She smiled when necessary and stayed silent when it was safer. By the time she reached adulthood, Catherine had already mastered the most important skill of her life, appearing harmless while becoming indispensable. She was still officially a nobody, a foreign wife trapped in a loveless marriage. But beneath the surface, something dangerous was forming. Not ambition alone, but discipline. And discipline, when paired with patience, would one day shake an empire. Catherine's marriage was not a partnership. It was a test of endurance. Her husband, Peter III of Russia, was everything a future ruler should not be. Petty, childish, insecure, and painfully unaware of how foolish he appeared to others. Where Catherine observed and calculated, Peter sulked and performed. He adored Prussia more than Russia, mocked Orthodox traditions, and seemed actively offended by the idea of responsibility. Their union, arranged purely for dynastic convenience, was cold from the start and only grew worse. Peter humiliated Catherine openly. He ignored her, insulted her, and surrounded himself with mistresses while making no effort to hide his contempt. The marriage remained unconsummated for years, not out of modesty or morality, but because Peter seemed far more interested in toy soldiers, crude jokes, and childish games than in his wife. At court, everyone noticed. Catherine, officially the future empress, was treated like a decorative afterthought. Yet this miserable arrangement taught her something invaluable. Power, she learned, often comes wrapped in incompetence. Peter's behavior alienated nearly everyone: nobles, clergy, guards, and even the empress herself. Catherine did not protest or dramatize her suffering. She endured it, and while enduring, she studied. She read relentlessly. Voltaire, Montesquieu, Plutarch, Enlightenment thinkers filled her nights while her husband embarrassed himself during the day. Catherine began to imagine a version of rule built on reason, reform, and authority rather than tantrums. But imagination alone would not save her. She needed allies. Slowly, carefully, she cultivated relationships at court. She listened more than she spoke. She remembered favors. She showed interest in people Peter ignored or insulted. Guards found her polite and attentive. Courtiers found her intelligent and composed. Clergy found her respectful. Catherine was building something invisible but powerful: goodwill. Meanwhile, Peter continued to sabotage himself. His open admiration for Prussian enemies of Russia made him deeply unpopular. His cruelty towards servants and disrespect toward tradition hardened resentment. Catherine did nothing to stop him. Why would she? Every foolish decision he made widened the gap between them and strengthened her position by contrast. By the time Empress Elizabeth's health began to fail, Catherine understood the stakes. If Peter became emperor, her life would be in danger. Discarded wives did not retire quietly in Russia. They vanished. Catherine was no longer just surviving a bad marriage. She was preparing for a moment when survival would require something far bolder. She did not yet reach for power. She waited. And in Russia, waiting patiently, silently, was often the most dangerous move of all. Catherine quickly understood that the Russian court was not governed by laws or morals, but by moods, loyalties, and fear. Titles mattered less than access. Bloodlines mattered less than proximity to power. And above all, survival depended on knowing when to speak and when to disappear into silence. This was not a world that rewarded honesty. It rewarded awareness. During the reign of Elizabeth of Russia, the court operated like a gilded minefield. Elizabeth herself was flamboyant, impulsive, and deeply suspicious. One careless word could lead to exile. One misplaced look could end a career. Catherine learned to read rooms the way generals read battlefields. She noted who stood close to the empress, who whispered after meetings, and who suddenly stopped appearing at dinners. Power, she realized, was not fixed. It flowed, and she needed to know its currents. Catherine also learned Russia beyond the palace walls. Unlike her husband, who despised Russian culture, she embraced it deliberately. She studied Orthodox rituals, memorized saints' names, and spoke Russian fluently and publicly. This was not sentimentality. It was camouflage. Every step she took erased a little more of her foreignness and replaced it with familiarity. Nobles began to see her not as a German bride, but as someone who understood Russia, or at least respected enough to try. Her marriage remained empty and humiliating, but Catherine turned isolation into freedom. She had no romantic expectations to maintain, no emotional illusions to protect. Instead, she gathered information. She learned which regiments were loyal to which commanders. She learned how bribes moved quietly through the court. She learned that the Imperial Guard, not laws or councils, ultimately decided who ruled. Catherine also learned something darker. Legitimacy was optional. Russia had a long tradition of coups, palace revolutions, and rulers who seized power first and justified it later. Bloodlines helped, but force decided. This realization did not frighten her. It clarified everything. While Peter alienated nearly everyone with his arrogance, Catherine did the opposite. She showed restraint. She displayed patience. She made herself useful. When Elizabeth fell ill repeatedly, Catherine remained visible but unobtrusive, present enough to be remembered, quiet enough to be trusted. By now, Catherine was no longer merely adapting. She was positioning. She had no army, no crown, and no official authority. Yet, people listened when she spoke. They sought her opinion. They confided in her. Influence, she discovered, did not require a throne. Russia was teaching her its oldest lesson. Power was not inherited, it was taken. And Catherine was finally learning how. By the time Catherine reached her late 20s, she had accepted a truth that polite society preferred to ignore. Affection was currency. In a court where marriage was hollow and loyalty flexible, intimacy often did more political work than treaties ever could. Catherine did not romanticize this reality. She used it. Her relationship with her husband was long past saving, but Catherine no longer needed it. Instead, she formed connections that mattered. Her lovers were not chosen for passion alone, but for position, influence, and discretion. These relationships were not reckless scandals. They were carefully managed alliances. Each one brought her information, protection, or support within powerful circles that Peter had already alienated. Most important among them was Grigory Olaf, a charismatic officer in the Imperial Guard. Olaf was bold, popular, and well-connected among the soldiers who truly controlled Russia's future. Through him, Catherine gained access to the one institution that mattered more than noble titles or royal blood: armed men willing to act. This was not love in the fairy tale sense. It was mutual ambition. Olaf believed Catherine would make a better ruler than Peter. Catherine understood that Olaf and his brothers could provide something she lacked: force around them. A quiet network began to form. Officers, guards, and courtiers, dissatisfied with Peter's behavior, found one another through whispered conversations and late-night meetings. Catherine did not lead these discussions loudly. She allowed others to speak first. She listened. She let consensus build naturally. Meanwhile, Peter continued to destroy himself. He insulted Russian officers, threatened reforms that would strip the nobility of privileges, and openly planned to sideline Catherine once he became emperor. Rumors spread that he intended to divorce her or confine her to a convent, a polite way of erasing her existence. Catherine understood the danger clearly. She was running out of time. Once Peter took the throne, her carefully constructed position could collapse overnight. Yet she still refused to rush. A failed coup meant death. Hesitation meant survival, until the moment it didn't. Behind closed doors, Catherine rehearsed a future that had once seemed impossible. She studied previous palace coups. She memorized mistakes. She learned that speed mattered more than legality, and confidence mattered more than permission. By now, Catherine was no longer simply enduring history. She was shaping it in secret. The conspiracies forming around her were not loud rebellions. They were quiet agreements built on a shared conclusion. Russia deserved better, and Catherine was ready to make herself the answer. The moment Catherine had been preparing for arrived in 1762, and it came faster than expected. Empress Elizabeth was dead. Her nephew ascended the throne as Peter III of Russia, and almost immediately began confirming everyone's worst fears. In just months, Peter managed to offend the army, the clergy, the nobility, and the public. An impressive achievement, even by Russian standards. He withdrew Russia from a hard-fought war against Prussia, abandoning allies and humiliating officers who had sacrificed everything. He threatened church lands, mocked Orthodox rituals, and surrounded himself with foreign advisors. Worse still, he spoke openly of removing Catherine from power, and possibly from life itself. The danger was no longer theoretical. It was immediate. The conspirators moved quickly. Gregory Olaf and his brothers activated loyal regiments of the Imperial Guard. Catherine was awakened early one morning with a single message. It was now or never. There would be no second chance. She dressed not as a queen, but as a soldier. Catherine rode to the barracks and stood before the guards, calm, composed, and unflinching. She did not beg. She did not plead her case. She spoke as if authority already belonged to her. And remarkably, the guards swore allegiance on the spot. Momentum once started became unstoppable. Within hours, Catherine was proclaimed empress. Church leaders blessed her rule. Nobles pledged loyalty. The city accepted the change with minimal resistance. Peter, stunned and isolated, was arrested without a fight. The empire changed rulers in a single day, not through chaos, but through precision. Peter was forced to abdicate. Days later, he died under mysterious circumstances while in custody. Officially, it was an accident. Unofficially, everyone understood the reality. Catherine never ordered his death, at least not on paper. She did not need to. Russia rarely required signatures for bloodshed. Catherine's seizure of power was illegal by every formal standard. She was not the rightful heir. She had no claim stronger than opportunity. Yet the coup succeeded because it aligned with what Russia wanted: stability, respect, and relief from embarrassment. Catherine understood this perfectly. She did not justify herself with sentiment. She justified herself with results. From the moment she took the throne, she ruled as if she had always belonged there. In one morning, a foreign princess with no legitimate claim became the most powerful woman in Europe. And Russia, restless, ruthless, and pragmatic, accepted her without hesitation. Once Catherine secured the crown, she understood that seizing power was only the beginning. Keeping it required something more sophisticated than force. Russia had seen plenty of rulers arrive through coups. What it lacked was a ruler who could explain her authority in a way that made sense to Europe and to history. Catherine chose enlightenment. She reinvented herself as a philosopher-empress. Catherine corresponded with leading intellectuals of the age. Voltaire and other thinkers who believed reason could civilize power. She presented herself not as a tyrant in silk, but as a monarch guided by law, education, and progress. Europe was eager to believe her. A woman who ruled Russia with a book in one hand and a scepter in the other was irresistible propaganda. Catherine drafted a grand document known as the Nakaz, a set of legal principles inspired by Enlightenment philosophy. It spoke of equality before the law, moderation of punishment, and rational governance. The irony was not lost on those who lived in Russia. While Catherine debated justice on paper, the empire still relied on serfdom, censorship, and absolute authority. Yet contradiction did not bother her. Ideas were tools, not promises. She expanded education dramatically, especially for the nobility. Schools multiplied. Art, theater, and literature flourished under her patronage. The Russian court became a cultural center rather than a provincial embarrassment. Catherine collected art obsessively, laying the foundations for institutions that would define Russian identity for centuries. At the same time, she ruled with precision. Rebellions were crushed swiftly. Critics were silenced politely or permanently. Catherine did not believe enlightenment required weakness. Order came first. Reform came second. Idealism came only when it did not threaten stability. Her brilliance lay in balance. To Europeans, she was the embodiment of reason. To Russian elites, she was a protector of privilege. To the army, she was decisive. To the church, she was respectful. Everyone saw what they needed to see. Catherine never pretended to abolish autocracy. She refined it. She dressed power in intellect and culture, making domination appear civilized. It was a masterclass in image management centuries before the term existed. By presenting herself as enlightened, Catherine disarmed critics while consolidating authority. Her reign became acceptable, then admired, then legendary. She had not just taken the throne, she had transformed the story around it. And stories Catherine knew better than most are often more powerful than laws. Catherine's reign, so polished on paper and admired abroad, was tested brutally when idealism collided with reality. In 1773, Russia erupted in one of the most dangerous uprisings in its history. A rebellion that exposed exactly how fragile Catherine's enlightened image really was. The revolt was led by Yin Pugachev, a former Cossack officer who claimed to be the miraculously escaped Peter III. The lie was obvious, but it barely mattered. Pugachev promised what Russia's lowest classes desperately wanted: freedom from serfdom, revenge against landlords, and an end to brutal exploitation. Tens of thousands rallied to him: peasants, Cossacks, escaped serfs, and the desperate. For Catherine, this was not merely a rebellion. It was an existential threat. If peasants could imagine a different ruler, they could imagine a different system. And imagination, once unleashed, was harder to crush than armies. The uprising spread rapidly across vast regions. Estates burned, nobles were murdered, officials fled. For a moment, the empire Catherine had carefully stabilized seemed ready to tear itself apart from below. Enlightenment ideals offered no solution here. Philosophy cannot stop pitchforks. Catherine's response was swift and merciless. She unleashed the full force of the imperial army. Villages suspected of aiding rebels were punished. Executions were public and deliberate. The message was unmistakable. Reform had limits and rebellion crossed them. When Pugachev was finally captured, Catherine made an example of him. He was paraded in chains, humiliated publicly, and executed in Moscow. His body was dismembered, his head displayed, not out of cruelty alone, but strategy. Fear, Catherine understood, was sometimes the most efficient form of governance. The rebellion changed her permanently. After Pugachev, Catherine abandoned any lingering fantasy of freeing the serfs. Instead, she strengthened noble control over them. Landowners gained more power, not less. Order mattered more than justice. To Europe, Catherine remained enlightened. To Russia, she became unmistakably absolute. The contradiction did not trouble her. Empires she knew were not held together by ideals, but by consequences. The rebellion had proven one thing beyond doubt. Catherine ruled not because she was kind, progressive, or beloved, but because she was willing to be feared when necessary, and that in Russia was the truest qualification of all. With rebellion crushed and authority unquestioned, Catherine turned outward. If internal order required fear, international greatness required expansion. She believed Russia's destiny was not merely to survive, but to dominate, to be feared abroad and respected at home, and she pursued that vision with relentless efficiency. Catherine expanded Russia's borders more than almost any ruler before her. Through wars against the Ottoman Empire, she secured warm water ports on the Black Sea, a strategic obsession of Russian rulers for generations. New cities rose from conquered territory. Crimea was absorbed. Trade routes opened. Russia was no longer a landlocked giant stumbling in the cold. It was a maritime power with ambitions stretching far beyond its borders. But Catherine's most controversial achievement came through diplomacy rather than war. The partitions of Poland. Alongside Prussia and Austria, she helped dismantle an entire kingdom piece by piece. There were treaties, justifications, and polite explanations. But the reality was simple. A weaker neighbor was erased because stronger empires found it convenient. Catherine justified this as stability. Poland, she argued, was chaotic and ungovernable. Russia was merely restoring order. In truth, she was extending influence while avoiding the costs of full-scale war. It was imperialism with paperwork. Under her rule, Russia's population grew, its territory expanded, and its prestige soared. European courts that once dismissed her as a usurper now treated her as a peer. Kings sought her approval. Philosophers praised her intellect. Diplomats feared her resolve. Yet expansion came at a price. Conquered peoples were absorbed without consent. Cultures were suppressed quietly. Resistance was managed, not solved. Catherine did not pretend empire was benevolent. She believed it was necessary. What made her dangerous was not cruelty, but clarity. She did not conquer out of vanity. She conquered because power demanded it. Every new border strengthened her legitimacy. Every victory rewrote her origin story from foreign interloper to indispensable ruler. By the end of her reign, Russia was unrecognizable from the state she inherited. Larger, stronger, more feared, Catherine had delivered what few rulers ever manage: results. And in the language of empire, results silence almost every question. By the time Catherine reached old age, she no longer needed to prove anything. She had ruled Russia for more than 3 decades, longer than most men, let alone women who seized power through a coup. The nervous foreign girl who once studied the court in silence was gone. In her place stood an empress who had reshaped an empire and bent Europe's opinion to her will. Catherine worked until the end. Even in her 60s, she maintained an exhausting schedule of correspondence, administration, and cultural patronage. She never stopped reading, writing, or governing. Power for her was not a phase of life. It was the structure of it. When she died suddenly in 1796, Russia did not collapse. That alone was proof of her success. Her son Paul inherited the throne and immediately set about undoing many of her policies driven by resentment and insecurity. Yet even his efforts could not erase her legacy. Catherine's reign had altered Russia too deeply. The empire she left behind was larger, stronger, and more self-confident than the one she had taken. History, however, has never known quite what to do with her. Catherine was brilliant, ruthless, enlightened, and brutal, sometimes all at once. She expanded education while deepening serfdom. She spoke of liberty while ruling absolutely. She championed philosophy while crushing rebellion without mercy. These contradictions were not accidents. They were choices. Her personal life became the subject of endless scandal, exaggeration, and rumor, often more graphic than accurate. Male rulers with dozens of mistresses were forgiven or admired. Catherine was caricatured. Her intellect was reduced to gossip. Her achievements were filtered through discomfort with female authority. Yet strip away the myths, and one truth remains. Catherine did what few rulers ever manage. She seized power illegally, justified it successfully, and governed so effectively that her origin story became irrelevant. Results erased legitimacy debates. Strength rewrote memory. She did not rule by pretending to be gentle. She ruled by understanding the world as it was, harsh, unequal, and unforgiving, and mastering it on her own terms. Catherine did not merely sit on the throne of Russia. She redesigned what it meant for a woman to wield absolute power and survive it. In the end, her greatest achievement was not conquest or reform. It was permanence. History did not remove her. It kept her. And that for an empress who was never supposed to exist is the ultimate victory. The space race did not begin with stars, wonder, or dreams of exploration. It began with suspicion. In the aftermath of World War II, the world fractured into two hostile visions of the future, led by the United States and the Soviet Union. Each believed the other was not just a rival, but an existential threat. Trust evaporated. Ideology hardened, and technology became the ultimate weapon. Both superpowers understood something crucial. Whoever mastered advanced science would control the future. Missiles, radar, nuclear physics, all were already reshaping warfare. Space was simply the next extension of that logic. A rocket powerful enough to reach orbit was also powerful enough to deliver a nuclear warhead anywhere on Earth. Space exploration and military dominance were inseparable from the very beginning, no matter how poetic the speeches sounded later. Publicly, both nations spoke of progress and peace. Privately, they watched each other obsessively. Every test launch, every scientific breakthrough, every failure mattered. Falling behind was not embarrassing. It was dangerous. If one side gained technological superiority, the balance of power could collapse overnight. Space became a scoreboard for global dominance. The Cold War was not fought with armies clashing directly. It was fought through symbols, proxies, and demonstrations of capability. Space offered the perfect stage. It was visible, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. A satellite in orbit could be tracked by anyone with a radio. A successful launch could be broadcast around the world. Victory in space translated instantly into prestige on Earth. There was also fear beneath the ambition. Leaders on both sides worried constantly about surprise attacks, technological gaps, and worst-case scenarios. Intelligence agencies warned of catastrophic consequences if the enemy achieved rocket superiority. Scientists were pressured to move faster. Engineers were pushed beyond safe limits. Politics seeped into laboratories. Ordinary citizens felt it too, even if they did not fully understand the technology. Civil defense drills, fallout shelters, and ominous news reports created a background hum of anxiety. Space was no longer distant and abstract. It was directly connected to survival. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the path was set. Rockets would rise not because humanity was ready to explore the cosmos, but because two superpowers were terrified of standing still. Space would become the ultimate arena where ambition, fear, pride, and ideology collided, far above the planet, but deeply rooted in its conflicts. The space race was never just about leaving Earth. It was about proving who deserved to shape it. On an October night in 1957, the world tilted slightly off its axis. The Soviet Union launched a polished metal sphere no larger than a beach ball into orbit. It had no cameras, no scientific instruments of real complexity, and no crew. All it did was beep. Yet that simple sound echoing through radio receivers across the globe triggered one of the greatest psychological shocks of the 20th century. The satellite was Sputnik 1, and it changed everything. For the first time, humanity had placed an object into orbit around Earth. More importantly, the Soviets had done it first. In the United States, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Newspapers spoke of humiliation. Politicians demanded answers. Ordinary citizens stared at the sky knowing that something Soviet was passing overhead every 96 minutes. The fear was not about science. It was about missiles. If Moscow could launch a satellite into orbit, then it could launch nuclear weapons across continents. The technological gap Americans had assumed did not exist suddenly felt enormous. Confidence collapsed overnight. Schools began emphasizing science and mathematics. Defense budgets ballooned. The term missile gap entered public consciousness whether it was real or not. For the Soviet leadership, Sputnik was pure propaganda gold. It proved that socialism could out-engineer capitalism. It embarrassed the West on a global stage and energized allies around the world. The beeping satellite became a symbol of modernity, discipline, and scientific prowess. Nikita Khrushchev understood this immediately. He demanded bigger, bolder demonstrations. Within weeks, the Soviets followed with Sputnik 2, carrying a dog named Laika. The ethical cost was high, but the political message was clear. The USSR was willing to push further, faster, and harder. Space had become theater. In Washington, panic turned into resolve. The failure was framed as a national crisis. Committees were formed. Agencies reorganized. The lesson was brutal, but simple. Hesitation meant humiliation. Sputnik was small, primitive, and short-lived. Yet, its impact was immense. With one orbiting object, the space race shifted from theory to reality. The race was no longer about who might reach space first. It was about who would catch up and who would fall permanently behind. And the beeping continued, a reminder that the Cold War had reached the sky. By the early 1960s, the space race had moved beyond machines. It was no longer enough to send metal into orbit. The next question was unavoidable and terrifying. Could a human survive the journey? The answer would not just demonstrate technological mastery, it would define national prestige. The Soviet Union moved first again. On an April morning in 1961, Yuri Gagarin was strapped into a small spherical capsule barely larger than his body. There was no real control system. If something went wrong, there would be no rescue. Gagarin understood this. So did his superiors. The mission was as much faith as engineering. When Gagarin's spacecraft completed a single orbit around Earth and returned safely, the victory was immediate and overwhelming. He became the first human to leave the planet. The image of a smiling Soviet pilot circling the globe was irresistible propaganda. He was young, calm, and heroic, the perfect symbol of socialist success. For the United States, the effect was crushing. Two Soviet firsts now defined the space race, the first satellite and the first man in space. American leaders feared that global opinion was slipping away. If the USSR could dominate space, what else could it dominate? Military power, influence in newly independent nations. The fear went far beyond orbit. Inside the American space program, pressure exploded. Engineers were told speed mattered more than comfort. Risk became acceptable. Perfection was a luxury no one could afford. Test pilots volunteered, knowing the odds were grim. Failure would be public. Success had to be spectacular. The race had also turned deeply personal. Gagarin was not just a cosmonaut. He was a walking challenge. His flight suggested that the USSR was bold enough to gamble with human lives to win prestige. The United States had to respond, but without appearing reckless. It was a narrow path. Gagarin himself never became a politician. He remained a symbol paraded across the world as proof that the future had arrived and that it spoke Russian. Behind the scenes, however, Soviet engineers knew the truth. Their lead was real, but fragile. Their technology was powerful, but rushed. One disaster could erase everything. That knowledge made the space race more dangerous than ever. Humans were now the payload, and every launch carried not just lives, but the reputation of an entire system. From this point forward, space would never be empty again. The United States could not afford another second place. After Yuri Gagarin's flight, American leadership understood that incremental progress would no longer be enough. A dramatic response was required, something so bold that it would reset the entire competition. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy delivered that response with a single sentence that stunned both allies and rivals. America would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. The moon was not chosen for scientific necessity. It was chosen for visibility. Everyone could see it. Everyone would understand the achievement. Reaching the moon required rockets more powerful than anything previously built, navigation systems of unprecedented accuracy, and an industrial effort bordering on madness. That was the point. The goal was so extreme that success would be undeniable. Kennedy's announcement transformed space into a national obsession. What had been a scattered collection of military and civilian projects was unified under one banner. The newly formed NASA was handed immense authority and an almost unlimited budget. Engineers, mathematicians, and technicians were pulled from universities and factories across the country. Entire cities were reshaped around launch sites and research centers. This was not a peaceful scientific endeavor. It was a mobilization. Schedules were brutal. Failures were hidden when possible and explained away when not. Rockets exploded. Capsules malfunctioned. Astronauts trained knowing that survival was uncertain. Yet the pressure never eased. Falling behind was unthinkable. The moon program also served another purpose. It reassured the American public. After Sputnik and Gagarin, confidence had been shaken. The moon promise offered redemption. It suggested that the United States was not losing the future. It was merely preparing a decisive move. Across the Iron Curtain, Soviet leaders watched carefully. The American plan was risky and expensive, but if it worked, it would eclipse every Soviet achievement to date. The USSR continued its own lunar ambitions, but internal rivalries and secrecy slowed progress. Unlike the American program, Soviet space efforts were fragmented and often competed internally for resources. The moon became more than a destination. It became a deadline, a finish line visible to the entire world. From that moment on, every launch, every test, and every failure on both sides was measured against one question: who would reach the moon first? The space race had entered its most dangerous phase, one where victory demanded everything. The race to the moon demanded speed, and speed demanded sacrifice. Behind the clean footage of launches and confident press conferences was a darker reality. Space exploration was lethal. Rockets were unstable. Computers were primitive. Margins for error were microscopic. And both superpowers knew that failure was not just possible. It was inevitable. In the United States, that reality became impossible to ignore in 1967. During a routine ground test, a fire tore through the Apollo 1 command module, killing 3 astronauts trapped inside. The capsule, filled with pure oxygen and lined with flammable materials, became an inferno in seconds. The tragedy shocked the nation and exposed how political pressure had pushed engineering beyond safe limits. Publicly, the United States mourned. Privately, the program froze. Engineers rewrote systems from scratch. Design philosophies changed overnight. Safety, once secondary to speed, was forced back into the conversation. The delay was costly, but essential. Without it, the moon program would never survive. The Soviet Union faced its own disasters, many of them hidden. Cosmonauts died in training accidents. Rockets exploded on launch pads. Entire crews were lost, but secrecy kept these failures out of international headlines. The Soviet strategy relied on silence. A failure not acknowledged could not weaken propaganda. Yet the human cost was real. Engineers worked knowing that mistakes could kill friends and colleagues. Test pilots climbed into experimental vehicles with minimal escape options. Both sides accepted a grim truth. Space exploration under Cold War conditions was warfare without bullets. Despite the risks, neither side slowed. Each disaster hardened resolve. Each funeral became justification for pushing forward. The dead were framed as heroes. sacrifices on the altar of progress. Questioning the mission became politically unacceptable. What made this phase especially cruel was its invisibility. The public saw success or silence, never the full price. Only decades later would the extent of the losses become clear. The space race was no longer a contest of imagination. It was a trial of endurance. How much failure could a nation absorb? How many lives could be lost before the dream collapsed under its own weight? For both superpowers, the answer was unsettling, as many as it took. By 1969, the space race had narrowed to a single moment. Years of explosions, funerals, redesigns, and political pressure converged on one mission that could not fail. If the United States succeeded, it would redefine the race. If it failed, the humiliation would be permanent. The mission was Apollo 11. 3 astronauts were launched at top a rocket taller than a skyscraper, powered by controlled explosions and hope. The technology was breathtakingly fragile. The onboard computer had less processing power than a modern calculator. A single serious malfunction would mean death, broadcast live to the world. As the spacecraft approached the moon, tension spiked. The lunar module began its descent and immediately ran into trouble. Alarm sounded. Fuel dropped dangerously low. Mission control calculated options in seconds. Abort or continue. There was no margin left for hesitation. Commander Neil Armstrong took manual control, steering away from a hazardous landing zone while fuel ticked down to seconds. When the module finally touched the surface, the words spoken were understated, almost absurdly calm. Yet across Earth, people held their breath. Hours later, Armstrong descended the ladder and stepped onto lunar soil. The act itself was simple. 1 foot placed on dust untouched for billions of years. But symbolically, it ended the space race. The image of an American astronaut standing on the moon was unmistakable. No satellite, no orbit, no propaganda victory could rival it. The Soviet Union watched in silence. They had led early. They had taken enormous risks, but they had lost the finish line that mattered most. The moon landing shifted global perception overnight. The United States was no longer catching up. It had won. Yet something unexpected happened. For a brief moment, the competition softened. People around the world, even in rival nations, watched together. The moon did not feel American. It felt human. That moment did not end the Cold War, but it did end the space race as it had been defined. The ultimate symbol of technological dominance had been claimed. After the moon, the question was no longer who would win, but what space was for now that victory had been achieved. After the moon landing, something strange happened. The space race did not explode into a new, even more ambitious phase. It slowed. The finish line had been crossed, and the urgency that once justified unlimited budgets and extreme risk began to evaporate. Victory, it turned out, was expensive to maintain. In the United States, the moon landings continued, but public attention faded quickly. What had once felt miraculous began to feel routine. Astronauts walked on the moon again and again, collected rocks, conducted experiments, and ratings dropped. Politicians quietly asked uncomfortable questions. Why spend vast sums to repeat a symbolic victory when domestic problems were piling up back on Earth? Budgets shrank. Ambitions narrowed. The dream of moon bases and missions to Mars was postponed indefinitely. Space was no longer a battlefield that demanded total commitment. It was a line item. For the Soviet Union, the outcome was more complicated. Officially, the USSR dismissed the moon as unnecessary spectacle. Privately, the failure stung deeply. Soviet lunar programs were quietly canceled, their existence denied for decades. Engineers who had pushed heroic efforts were reassigned. The propaganda machine pivoted toward long-duration spaceflight and space stations, areas where the Soviets could still lead without confronting the moon directly. This shift marked a fundamental change. Space was no longer about dramatic firsts, but endurance. Cooperation began to creep in where rivalry once dominated. The symbolism of space softened. It became less about ideology and more about utility. The most striking symbol of this transition came in 1975, when American and Soviet spacecraft docked in orbit during a joint mission. Former rivals shook hands above the Earth they had once threatened to annihilate. The gesture did not erase decades of hostility, but it signaled a new reality. Space no longer needed to be a battlefield. The space race had not ended with a treaty or surrender. It ended with exhaustion. Both sides had proven what they needed to prove. The future no longer demanded spectacle at any cost. What followed was quieter, slower, and far less cinematic, but perhaps more honest. Space had moved from a contest of power to a shared environment. And for the first time since Sputnik, the silence above Earth felt less threatening. When the drama faded and the headlines moved on, the space race left behind something far more permanent than flags on the moon. It reshaped how humanity lived, communicated, and understood itself, often in ways its original architects never intended. Many of the technologies developed under extreme Cold War pressure entered everyday life. Satellites transformed communication, allowing signals to cross oceans instantly. Weather forecasting became dramatically more accurate. Navigation systems evolved from military tools into civilian necessities. Materials designed to survive vacuum and radiation found their way into medicine, transportation, and consumer products. The race to dominate space had accidentally modernized Earth. Perhaps more important was the psychological shift. For the first time in history, humans saw their planet from the outside. Photographs of Earth hanging in black space altered global consciousness. Borders vanished. Nations shrank. The idea that humanity shared a single fragile home became harder to ignore. Ironically, a competition rooted in division produced the most powerful image of unity ever recorded. The space race also rewrote the relationship between science and government. It proved that massive coordinated investment in research could achieve the seemingly impossible, but only at enormous cost. Future generations inherited both the benefits and the cautionary lessons. Innovation thrived under pressure, but it also bent ethics, hid failures, and treated human lives as acceptable losses. For scientists and engineers, the era became mythic, a time when deadlines were absolute, resources vast, and failure unacceptable. It inspired generations to pursue science, technology, and exploration, even as it warned them about the dangers of political interference in research. The rivalry also changed geopolitics. Space became a domain that could not be claimed like land or sea. Treaties emerged to limit weapons in orbit. Cooperation, once unthinkable, became practical. Space stations replaced moon races. Joint missions replaced secret competitions. The sky, once a battlefield, slowly turned into shared territory. Yet the space race left unresolved questions. Who owns space? Who benefits from its resources? Should exploration serve nations, corporations, or humanity as a whole? These debates still echo today, shaped by decisions made under Cold War pressure decades ago. In the end, the space race built more than rockets. It built a new age, one where Earth was no longer the ceiling of human ambition, but the starting point. The race had ended, but its consequences were only beginning. The space race is often remembered as a competition with a clear winner, but that memory is misleading. Yes, the United States reached the moon first. Yes, the Soviet Union never caught up to that final symbol. But history rarely ends cleanly. What truly mattered was not who won, but what the race permanently changed. The space race proved that human ambition could break boundaries once thought absolute. For the first time, the sky was no longer the limit. That psychological shift did not disappear when budgets were cut or programs canceled. It lingered. Every satellite launch, every space probe, every modern mission to Mars traces its lineage back to that Cold War obsession with superiority. At the same time, the race exposed the dangers of tying exploration too closely to politics. Decisions were rushed, risks were hidden, lives were lost quietly to preserve national pride. Progress was real, but it was uneven and often cruel. The space race succeeded because it was fueled by fear, and that same fear nearly broke it more than once. As the Cold War thawed, space slowly transformed from a symbol of domination into one of cooperation. Former enemies learned to share orbit. Scientists collaborated across borders that once seemed unbreakable. The sky no longer echoed with ideological threats, but with radio signals carrying shared data and joint missions. Yet, the legacy remains unresolved. Space is once again becoming competitive. New nations and private companies now chase prestige, resources, and strategic advantage beyond Earth. The old questions have returned in modern form. Who controls space? Who profits from it? Who is allowed to dream beyond the planet? The space race offers a warning and a promise. It shows how quickly ambition can turn exploration into conflict. But it also shows what humanity can accomplish when it dares to aim higher than survival alone. In the end, the most important outcome of the space race was not a footprint on the moon or a flag planted in dust. It was the realization that Earth is small, fragile, and shared, and that our greatest achievements happen when rivalry gives way, even briefly, to wonder. The Cold War reached for the stars out of fear. Humanity kept going out of curiosity, and that difference may decide what space becomes next. Long before writing recorded laws, kings, or wars, humans were already gathering around boards etched into stone and wood. Play did not emerge as entertainment alone. It emerged as a way to understand the world. In societies where survival depended on forces beyond control, weather, disease, fate, and conflict, games became miniature versions of life itself. They taught patience, risk, timing, and acceptance of loss long before philosophy gave those ideas names. Archaeologists have uncovered game pieces in some of the oldest human settlements, often buried alongside tools, jewelry, and even the dead. This placement was not accidental. Games were meaningful. They carried symbolic weight, suggesting that play mattered not just in life, but beyond it. To play was to rehearse existence, to face uncertainty in a controlled space. Among the earliest known board games is the royal game of Played over 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. Its board was carefully decorated, its rules complex enough to reward strategy, yet still dependent on chance. Dice rolls determined movement, but decisions determined survival. Much like ancient life, skill mattered, but luck always had the final word. These early games were often tied to religion and ritual. Winning was not just success. It could be interpreted as divine favor. Losing could reflect moral failure or bad fortune. In this way, games blurred the line between play and belief. They offered a safe way to engage with the terrifying unpredictability of existence. Importantly, games were social. They created shared rules in a world that often lacked fairness. Two players could sit as equals, bound by agreed constraints, even if their real lives were shaped by hierarchy and power. In that sense, board games were quietly radical. They imagined order where chaos ruled. Children learned by watching elders play. Strategies passed between generations. Moves became traditions. Games survived because they adapted, evolving with the cultures that played them. A board scratched in the dirt could travel across centuries without ever needing to be written down. By the time history began recording kings and conquests, games were already ancient. They had taught humans how to wait, how to plan, how to lose gracefully, and how to hope that the next roll might change everything. Play did not follow civilization. It helped build it. As civilizations grew more complex, board games absorbed deeper meaning. They were no longer just reflections of daily uncertainty. They became symbols of cosmic order, morality, and the afterlife itself. Nowhere was this more evident than in ancient Egypt, where games were woven directly into religious belief. One of the most famous examples is Senet, played by pharaohs, nobles, and commoners alike. Senet was far more than a pastime. Its board represented the journey of the soul through the underworld. Each move symbolized progress toward eternal life, while setbacks reflected spiritual danger. Winning was not simply victory. It was proof of harmony with divine order. Senet boards were placed in tombs alongside food, jewelry, and spells. The dead were expected to continue playing in the afterlife, navigating fate even beyond death. To ancient Egyptians, play did not stop when life ended. It followed the soul. Far from Egypt, similar ideas emerged independently. In ancient China, the game of Go appeared. Elegant, abstract, and endlessly complex. Unlike games driven by luck, Go emphasized patience, balance, and long-term thinking. Its goal was not total destruction of the opponent, but control through subtle positioning. This mirrored Chinese philosophy, where harmony and restraint were valued over brute force. Go was associated with scholars, generals, and emperors. It trained the mind for governance and warfare alike. Every stone placed on the board echoed decisions made in real life, irreversible, strategic, and deeply interconnected. Mistakes cannot be undone, only compensated for. The game taught responsibility across cultures. Board games began to serve as moral instructors. They modeled ideal behavior, foresight, discipline, respect for rules, and acceptance of consequence. Cheating was not clever. It was corrupt. Losing was not shameful. It was educational. What is striking is how similar these games were in purpose despite vast distances between cultures. Without contact, societies reached the same conclusion. Play was a safe way to explore power, fate, and ethics. Games became classrooms without teachers, sermons without priests. By this stage, board games had moved beyond leisure. They were tools for shaping how people thought about life, death, and order. The board was no longer just a surface. It was a world small enough to control, yet vast enough to reflect reality. And humanity kept playing. As societies became more hierarchical and warfare more organized, board games evolved into training grounds for power. Play was no longer just about fate or the soul. It became preparation. Rulers, generals, and elites embraced games that rewarded foresight, deception, and long-term planning. Winning meant thinking several moves ahead, much like surviving in politics or war. No game embodies this shift more clearly than chess. Emerging from India as Chaturanga before spreading across Persia and into Europe, chess transformed conflict into abstraction. Kings, queens, bishops, and knights mirrored real social roles. The board became a battlefield where hierarchy mattered, sacrifice was necessary, and one mistake could doom everything. Chess taught restraint. Power was not unleashed recklessly. It was positioned, protected, and sometimes deliberately lost to secure a greater goal. For medieval nobles, this was not a metaphor. It was instruction to rule, meant to calculate consequences, not rush into combat. It is no accident that chess became associated with intelligence, discipline, and elite education. Elsewhere, strategy took different forms. In ancient Scandinavia, games like Henneful simulated asymmetric warfare. One side defended a king attempting escape, while the other sought to capture him. Victory did not depend on equal forces, but on positioning and timing, reflecting the realities of Viking raids and defensive struggles. In South Asia, games such as Pashi blended strategy with chance, mirroring social mobility and rigid caste systems. Skill mattered, but fortune could elevate or destroy anyone. This balance made the game widely accessible, played by royalty and villagers alike. What unified these games was their social function. They reinforced values admired by each culture: patience, loyalty, bravery, cleverness. Games became markers of status. To play well signaled education and refinement. To play poorly suggested recklessness or lack of control. Importantly, these games also spread through conquest and trade. As empires expanded, so did their games. Rules adapted, pieces changed shape, but the core lessons remained. A board game could travel farther and last longer than an army. By the medieval period, board games had become mirrors of society's power structures. They taught players how the world worked, who mattered, who moved freely, and who existed to be protected or sacrificed. Play had become political, and the board, once a ritual space, was now a classroom for command. As board games spread across continents, they did not always carry noble lessons or spiritual meaning. Many became entangled with chance, money, and vice, and society reacted accordingly. Dice games, race games, and betting boards exploded in popularity because they were simple, fast, and thrilling. They also terrified authorities. One of the most enduring games of chance was backgammon, a descendant of much older Mesopotamian race games. Its mix of dice and strategy made it irresistible. Anyone could win. Skill helped, but luck could overturn even the smartest plan in seconds. That unpredictability mirrored real life, and that was precisely the problem. In medieval and early modern Europe, games of chance became deeply associated with gambling. Taverns echoed with dice rolls and shouted wages. Money, property, and sometimes freedom changed hands over a board. Clergy and lawmakers condemned these games as distractions from work, faith, and moral discipline. In some cities, dice games were banned outright, lumped together with drunkenness and disorder. Yet, suppression rarely worked. Games thrive precisely because they offer an escape from rigid social hierarchies. A peasant could beat a noble, and nobody could walk away wealthy. For a few moments, the board erased class, law, and destiny. That kind of freedom was intoxicating. Authorities responded by trying to control play rather than eliminate it. Some games were rebranded as respectable when played without money. Others were confined to certain classes or locations. Courts embraced games that emphasized strategy and decorum while condemning those tied too closely to chance. This tension revealed something important. Board games had become mirrors of social anxiety. Games that rewarded planning aligned with ideals of discipline and control. Games driven by luck threatened those ideals. They suggested that effort did not always equal reward, a dangerous idea in societies built on obedience. Ironically, rulers themselves often indulged in gambling games behind closed doors. Kings and nobles lost fortunes at the same tables they publicly condemned. The board exposed hypocrisy as clearly as it exposed risk. By the early modern period, games had split into categories. Some were educational, some strategic, some recreational, some sinful. That division shaped how games would evolve in the centuries to come. Board games were no longer just reflections of society. They were battlegrounds where ideas about work, fairness, and fate collided, one roll of the dice at a time. By the 19th century, board games began to change purpose once again. As industrialization reshaped daily life, play started to mirror economics, labor, and social systems rather than gods or kings. The board was no longer just a battlefield or moral lesson. It became a model of how society functioned, and sometimes how it failed. In Victorian Europe and America, a new class of educational board games emerged. These games taught children geography, history, punctuality, and obedience. Progress along the board rewarded discipline and hard work. Falling behind meant punishment or delay. The message was clear. Success came for following rules and staying on track. Play quietly reinforced the values of an industrial world that demanded order and productivity. But not everyone accepted that message without question. In the early 20th century, the game appeared that openly criticized the system it portrayed. Created by Elizabeth Magie, the landlord's game was designed to expose the dangers of monopolies and unchecked wealth. Players experienced how land ownership concentrated power and crushed competition. It was meant to be a warning, not entertainment. Ironically, the critique was too effective. The game was simplified, commercialized, and stripped of its original political message. It re-emerged as Monopoly, now celebrating the very system it once condemned. Players were no longer meant to question inequality. They were encouraged to dominate it. Winning meant bankrupting friends and family with a smile. This transformation revealed something crucial about modern board games. They were no longer just reflections of society. They could be tools of ideology. A set of rules could normalize greed, competition, or cooperation depending on how the game was framed. Play shaped belief. Monopoly's success was explosive. It became a household staple, teaching generations how rent, ownership, and debt worked, often before they encountered them in real life. The board became preparation for adulthood in a capitalist world. At the same time, cooperative games and moral alternatives continued to exist quietly, offering different visions of success. But mass popularity favored competition. Winning mattered. Accumulation mattered. By the early 20th century, board games had become cultural mirrors with sharp edges. They taught players not just how to play, but how to think about power, money, and each other. The board was no longer ancient or sacred. It was modern, and it was teaching lessons every time someone rolled the dice. As the 20th century progressed, board games absorbed the fears and ambitions of a world shaped by global conflict. 2 world wars, nuclear tension, and ideological standoffs transformed how people thought about strategy, territory, and control. Naturally, those anxieties found their way onto the board. Games began to simulate global domination and military logistics. One of the clearest examples was Risk, which turned the world map into a battlefield of probability and ambition. Players commanded armies, invaded continents, and calculated odds with every roll of the dice. Victory required not just aggression, but diplomacy, timing, and betrayal. Alliances were temporary. Trust was conditional. It felt uncomfortably familiar to anyone living through the Cold War. Unlike chess, where information was perfect and symmetrical, risk embraced uncertainty. Dice could ruin even the best plan. This randomness echoed modern warfare where technology, intelligence, and chance collided unpredictably. The game taught a subtle lesson. Power was never absolute, and dominance was always fragile. At the same time, other games moved in the opposite direction. Scrabble turned inward, rewarding language, literacy, and creativity rather than conquest. In a century defined by destruction, Scrabble offered something gentler, competition through vocabulary rather than violence. It reflected the rise of education, mass literacy, and the belief that intellect could be playful rather than elitist. What united these games was their migration into the living room. Board games became family rituals, not elite pastimes. Mass production made them affordable. Advertising framed them as wholesome bonding experiences, even when their mechanics were ruthless. Children learned negotiation from Risk, spelling from Scrabble, money management from Monopoly, often without realizing they were being trained. These games also reflected a changing pace of life. As work became more abstract and bureaucratic, games offered clear rules and visible outcomes. You could see progress. You could win. In a confusing world, the board provided clarity. Yet, even in leisure, tension remained. Games taught competition as normal, loss as instructive, and rules as sacred. They mirrored the systems people lived under, reinforcing ideas about success and failure. By mid-century, board games were no longer niche or ancient curiosities. They were cultural infrastructure, quiet teachers shaping how millions thought about conflict, cooperation, and control. The world was changing fast. The board kept up. By the late 20th century, something unexpected happened. After decades of mass-market games dominated by luck, elimination, and endless repetition, players began to want more. They wanted decisions to matter. They wanted stories, tension, and fairness. Quietly at first, then all at once, board games evolved again. This shift began most clearly in Germany, where designers rejected long player elimination and punishing randomness. Instead, they focused on systems that rewarded planning, balance, and participation until the very end. These games became known as Eurogames, and they changed everything. One of the most influential was Settlers of Catan. There were no armies, no global domination, and no player was ever knocked out. Victory came through negotiation, resource management, and timing. Trade replaced war. Cooperation and competition coexisted uneasily, much like modern economies. The game was tense, social, and deeply strategic, and it felt new. This design philosophy spread rapidly. Games like Carcassonne and Ticket to Ride emphasized spatial planning, incremental advantage, and accessibility. They were easy to learn, but difficult to master. Importantly, they respected the player's time. Sessions ended predictably. Losses felt earned, not arbitrary. At the same time, hobbyist communities exploded. Dedicated game stores, conventions, and online forums connected players across countries. Designers became known by name. Rule sets became experimental. Themes expanded beyond war and wealth into farming, disease control, storytelling, and survival. Games were no longer just products. They were authored experiences. This era also reintroduced cooperation in a meaningful way. In games like Pandemic, players worked together against the system itself. The enemy was not each other, but collapse. Winning required communication, sacrifice, and trust. It reflected a growing awareness that modern problems were shared and could not be solved alone. What made this revolution significant was not complexity, but intention. Designers asked new questions. What emotions should a game create? What behaviors should it reward? What stories should emerge naturally from play? For the first time in centuries, board games were no longer simply mirroring society. They were actively imagining alternatives, and players noticed. At the turn of the 21st century, many assumed board games were finished. Video games dominated attention. Screens were faster, louder, and endlessly updated. Why sit around cardboard and wooden pieces when entire worlds live behind glass? For a moment, it seemed inevitable that board games would fade into nostalgia. They did not. Instead, something unexpected happened. As life became increasingly digital, board games gained a new appeal precisely because they were physical. You had to sit together. You had to touch pieces, read faces, argue, negotiate, and laugh in real time. In a world of online avatars and endless scrolling, board games offer presence. Modern designers leaned into this strength. Games became more tactile, more beautiful, more deliberate. Artwork mattered. Components felt substantial. Opening a box became part of the experience. A board game was no longer just rules. It was an object, a ritual, a shared table. At the same time, themes expanded dramatically. Games explored history, ecology, psychology, and narrative in ways once reserved for novels or films. Story-driven games blurred the line between play and storytelling, allowing players to shape outcomes through choice rather than chance. Legacy games introduced permanence. Decisions made in one session permanently altered the board for the next. Consequences mattered again. Ironically, digital tools helped fuel this revival. Online forums, crowdfunding platforms, and video reviews connected designers directly to players. Small studios could reach global audiences. Risky ideas found supporters. Innovation accelerated. Board games also adapted rather than resisted technology. Apps assisted setup, tracked hidden information, or added atmosphere without replacing human interaction. Screens became tools, not replacements. The heart of the experience remained face-to-face. What truly saved board games, however, was emotional fatigue. Digital life is fast, fragmented, and isolating. Board games are slow, focused, and communal. They demand attention and reward it. You cannot multitask. You must be present. In this sense, modern board games became a quiet rebellion. They resisted speed. They resisted isolation. They insisted that play was something done together, not consumed alone. Far from being obsolete, board games found a new role. They became anchors in a distracted world. Spaces where rules were clear, time was shared, and human connection mattered more than efficiency. The screen did not kill the board. It reminded people why the board mattered in the first place. After thousands of years, the most remarkable thing about board games is not how much they have changed, but how little their core purpose has shifted. From carved stones in ancient settlements to beautifully illustrated modern boxes, board games continue to do what they always have: bring people together to practice being human. At their heart, board games are shared agreements. Everyone at the table accepts the same rules, the same limits, and the same risks. In a world that often feels unfair or chaotic, that agreement matters. It creates a temporary society where outcomes are visible, consequences are clear, and everyone begins on equal ground. For a few hours, the world makes sense. Board games also preserve something increasingly rare: slow interaction. They require patience. You wait your turn. You watch others succeed or fail. You learn to manage frustration, disappointment, and restraint. These are not flashy skills, but they are essential ones, and play teaches them gently. Across history, board games have reflected the concerns of their time. Ancient games wrestled with fate and the afterlife. Medieval games mirrored hierarchy and war. Industrial games modeled economics and productivity. Modern games explore cooperation, scarcity, systems, and survival. Each era leaves its fingerprint on the board, but board games also outlast those eras. Empires fall. Technologies change. Yet the act of sitting across from another person, negotiating rules, and rolling dice remains meaningful. Grandparents teach games to grandchildren. Rules are misremembered. House variations emerge. Laughter replaces precision. The game evolves through people, not despite them. This is why board games endure when so many forms of entertainment burn out quickly. They are not passive. They ask something of you: attention, emotion, presence. You cannot scroll through a board game. You must engage. In recent years, As life has grown faster and more fragmented, board games have quietly reclaimed an old role. They are excuses to gather, to unplug, to argue harmlessly, to cooperate, to compete without consequence, to lose without ruin. They remind us that play is not childish. It is foundational. It is how humans test ideas, rehearse conflict, and practice empathy in a space where failure is allowed. From the royal game to the modern tabletop renaissance, the board has always been more than wood and cardboard. It is a mirror, a classroom, and a meeting place. And as long as humans want to connect face to face, to think, to laugh, to challenge one another, the board will never be